Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for the Pedagogy of Trauma presented by Elizabeth M. Fincher. This meeting is being recorded, and just so you guys know, in order to receive a certificate at the end, you have to fill out the program evaluation. But I'll pass it over to you guys now.
Thank you so much. So good afternoon. I am Elizabeth Fincher. My bona fides include a long career as a counselor and behavioral health consultant, guest lecturer, preceptor, and clinical supervisor for programs, students, and licensure. I'm a PhD student here at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology in international psychology. Now, though I'm currently practicing in the United States, having that global perspective and understanding allows me to treat patients from all over the world. At last count, I think I had patients from about 15 different countries. The pedagogy of trauma is near and dear to my heart because I work on interdisciplinary teams, both as a student and as a professional, and with others who have no training in working with trauma. First, I would like to begin with the land acknowledgement. I am sitting on the ancestral lands of the peoples who are forced to become the consolidated tribes of Warm Springs in Central Oregon. Because we're going to be talking about violence and trauma, I want to see if we can do a brief, just breathing to get ourselves grounded. Okay, now I have to get us back from being grounded. All right, well, this system isn't quite working the way I was hoping it would work.
Are you trying to play the YouTube video or come back to the slides?
I'm actually trying to come back to the slide. Oh, there we go.
Okay, there.
Nope, still not coming back.
You should be able to X out of the YouTube video if you haven't already. I know sometimes the little Zoom box gets lost around if you have a lot of windows open. Maybe you can try clicking through those.
No, it won't even let me get back to. With the new Macs, they eliminated the ability to use multiple screens, which is really not all that helpful, I'm discovering. Oh, there we go. All right, thank you for your patience.
Of course.
So today our learning objectives are having some classroom strategies for introducing emotional regulation and self-care strategies, finding some tools for increasing emotional regulation, and having tools for identifying students who are at higher risk for re-traumatization or secondary or vicarious traumas. So both Desmond Tutu and Gabor Mate have some quotes that guide me as I'm doing my work and with an eye to developing the next generation of providers. I call this presentation the pedagogy of trauma, but I am including any potential toxic stressor. In other words, a stressor or stressors that stress the body to the extent that adrenaline and cortisol flood the system or create a steady drip, causing changes to the body. When I was in the Masters of Social Work program, one of our assignments was listening to a podcast from the Buffalo School of Social Work. That podcast stated that 50% of all social workers who leave the profession, they do so with at least one symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder. As Desmond Tutu pointed out, instead of fishing people out of the river, let's figure out what pushed them in. The pedagogy of trauma is the upstream, and a strong pedagogy is part of prevention through identifying students who are at risk for further traumatization, providing tools for promoting resiliency, and building our capacity for witnessing trauma. The Mate quote resonates that although college students are not children, as professors and supervisors, we need to be the vessels that hold space and validate the student experiences as they learn to witness trauma. We are also modeling how to hold space, which they will be asked to do for their patients or clients or colleagues. So what we owe our students. Hopefully we are experiencing a moral dilemma when exposing students to trauma, because experiencing the dilemma is an indication that we need to tread with intentionality, focused on the do no harm or mitigating the chances of harm while preparing students for the professional roles. Principle A of the APA Code of Ethics focuses on beneficence and non-malfeasance, which speaks to the care from harm. Psychologists are tasked with safeguarding the welfare of those with whom they work. As the Code of Ethics further identifies the responsibility to take reasonable steps to avoid harm to students. And it appears mandated by the ACA Code of Ethics, as they also include non-malfeasance or the avoiding of actions that cause harm, and working for the good of the individual and society by promoting mental health and well-being. The National Association of Social Work Code of Ethics identifies the importance of human relationships and that social workers promote, restore, maintain, and enhance the well-being of individuals. Trauma is ubiquitous. Therefore, students of psychology, counseling, and social work are very likely to be engaged in work that involves some level of trauma, no matter what academic track or label the students are given. Leaders of organizations are likely to interface with trauma, whether in response to a traumatic event or internally as their own staff is exposed to situations that carry the risk for secondary or vicarious trauma. As the APA Code of Ethics expects psychologists to work in a professional capacity to mitigate the harm to students, all students in programs of psychology and other programs must be prepared to encounter trauma and have the tools to manage engagement with traumatic events and or traumatized people. So I have two case studies that I want to use, and as we're going through the rest of my presentation, if you would just keep these case studies in mind to kind of help filter maybe some of the ideas that I'm presenting today. So the first case study involves my son Vietnam. I'm sorry, Son Mai. Son Mai is where the My Lai massacre occurred. That was part of the US war on Vietnam. At the site of that former hamlet is a museum documenting the massacre, including identifying the soldiers who refused to participate. Outside of the museum is an area dedicated to acknowledging the various international reconciliations that have taken place since the massacre. If you can see it in the picture, but this is a sidewalk that runs throughout the former village. These cement sidewalks have been created to emulate the dusty footpaths that link the village. Included in the cement are various size footprints that are small child to adult sized, indicating the various occupants and their movements around the village. Further back at the site is the Son Mai Memorial, dedicated to the various hamlets that were on the receiving end of the massacre. So here's the field experience. 4 students from a public administration and public policy program, which focused on social sustainability, visited the Son Mai along with 2 professors. Students knew before signing up for the class that this site would be visited. Only 1 student with any experience with trauma as part of the profession was present, as the other 3 were public policy students. All had some personal history of trauma. The heaviness of the upcoming visit was discussed on the bus ride to the memorial, with 1 professor leading the discussion. At the memorial, the students were allowed to wander at their own pace, stay as a group, pair up, or go independently. The students started as a group and slowly separated from each other as they decided their own paces and levels of engagement with the exhibits. All 4 students walked the village independently and had the opportunity to interact with each other as they crossed paths. One by one, they eventually ended up at the Sun Mai Memorial, where they chose to stand together at times, and at other times they were left in their own thoughts and feelings. Incense was offered in the space, which all 4 elected to light during their time at the memorial statue. In Buddhist countries like Vietnam, incense carries our prayers and our thoughts to the heavens, and the act of lighting the incense carried their various thoughts and feelings and seemed to be a fitting tribute. After the memorial, the students slowly gathered back in the courtyard of the site, and discussion and time spent together processing the trauma was at the sole discretion of the students. The second field experience took place in Berlin, Germany. Berlin was divided into East Germany and West Germany as part of the peace settlement between the 4 allied countries of the US. 4 countries of the US, Britain, USSR, and France. Berlin was made whole in 1987 as the Cold War was ending. As such, Berlin houses the Sachsenhausen, the Holocaust Museum, the Stasi prison, and the topography of terror. One day of peace was spent on each of these topics, hearing from the survivors and the researchers. So here was the part of the field experience. Given the pandemic, the field experience in Germany was done virtually, although this may be the norm for online learning. Students were not given a choice of countries for the field experiences. Students were identified as being from a trauma track or from an organization and systems track. Those from the trauma track ranged from mental health professionals with some experience working with trauma to those who are very experienced. Students from the organizations and systems track had various backgrounds with little experience working with trauma. One student had specifically asked not to attend this class because of the historical and intergenerational trauma that was intensely personal as a survivor of the Holocaust. This request was denied. Students in this field experience class were not provided a syllabus that fully outlined the topics that would be explored. A redacted sample syllabus was provided 14 days into the class, which outlined some possible subjects, but could not be relied on for either the topic nor the day that topic would be introduced. Each morning of the in-country days, the professor would email the topic and the assignments. However, at least one student was not receiving this much notice because of the use of an incorrect email address. Each in-country morning, the professors discussed the upcoming topic. As this was a virtual experience, students met via Zoom with the professors and the various speakers, but were left on their own to view films or to engage in research. Students had an opportunity to reach out to the others independently, and a debriefing did occur at the end of the class. Students voiced concern over not knowing what to do with the emotional dysregulation they were experiencing because of the topics that were related to the trauma. Students from the organizations and systems track who had no experience working with trauma appeared to be the most concerned. Students who were experienced mental health professionals attempted to help the distressed students to re-regulate and to reduce the amount of dysregulation on subsequent days. So these are the 2 experiences that I would like you to have in the back of your mind as we're going through this. So this combination of various tracks, professions, and experiences with witnessing the trauma of others, of both in the both group of students that were involved in the case study, is indicative of the growing focus on bringing together divergent peoples to solve problems in new ways. The focus of this Unity Conference is understanding this necessity of integration and transformation as part of our profession. One of these innovations in healthcare is the development of interprofessional teams, which are a transformative change that add value due to the synergy of the team. However, as interprofessional teams become the norm and the engagement of cross-functional teams to foster innovation, to share leadership, and to engage with multiple stakeholders, we need to have this understanding that we have teammates and colleagues who do not have the same level of experience working with trauma. For example, in my world, I work with interpreters, primary care providers, community health workers, translators, and we all have different experiences of coming together to work with trauma. In 2017, there was an estimation that 500 million people worldwide are experiencing symptoms of post-traumatic stress. And we need to have this understanding that no one works in a vacuum. We've been talking a lot about the need for self-care, but if we're working for agencies and for bosses and supervisors who don't understand trauma and don't understand the need for those self-care strategies and those needs for days off, we're not likely to get that support that we need. So this also allows us to recognize that we're already working in systems of care, whether or not we're currently working together on interprofessional teams, and how we do our work continues to evolve. So I mentioned that I work with a multidisciplinary team. Not only do those team members need to understand how trauma presents so they can respond appropriately to patients, our PCPs need to know how trauma presents in the body. My colleagues that I refer to in private practice are reliant on crisis teams and other crisis response in the community. The patients, the staff, and the community partners alike are dependent on the Oregon Health Plan, which is managed by our local coordinated care organization, which is another community partner that is proactive in helping us co-manage patients with complex needs. The taxpayer is another player in our system of care, as without taxes, there are no organizations in the system. Globalization caused the historical and intergenerational trauma that we see our patients experiencing. And globalization continues to shape who we come into contact with and the types of traumas that our patients are experiencing. And each one of those patients is interfacing with the systems that are in place, given this prevalence of trauma. And given this prevalence of traumas, the question is, how do we educate and inform individuals about psychological trauma without psychologically traumatizing or re-traumatizing them? And this is how we come to trauma education. A Boston University report published in 2022 identified that the mental health of college students has declined over the previous 8 years, with a 135% increase in depressive symptoms and 100% increase from symptoms of anxiety. And these rates for college students of color are even higher. Yet these are the students we need to encourage to join the counseling profession, as they are grossly underrepresented in this field. In a study by Adams and Riggs in 2008, there was an indication that 25% of students have had no formal training around working with clients who have experienced trauma. It can be assumed that students outside of social work, counseling, or psychology have even less exposure to formal training. These are the students who are most likely to show up in our non-licensure tracks. Therefore, programs must offer trauma-informed educational practices. The focus of the trauma-informed educational practice included training for future service providers and the leaders of those organizations on how to identify the presentations of trauma, build an awareness of intergenerational, historical, and racialized traumas, thus ensuring settings, procedures, treatments, and policies are not re-traumatizing. And we also must learn how to reduce the risks of secondary and vicarious trauma. This idea seeks to create individuals who can work from a culture that understands trauma, whether or not they ever provide direct services. One of the recommendations for working around and discussing trauma is to refer to trauma by the 4 violences. So rather than using terms such as adverse childhood experiences or toxic stressors to identify trauma-causing events or experiences, Farrell and Taylor recommend focusing on the systems, structures, and events that individuals perceive as traumatic and that are likely to lead to the development of acute stress disorders or post-traumatic stress. In doing so, Farrell and Taylor identified 4 types of violence, which are cultural, include racism, gender inequality and discrimination; structural violence, including poverty, unemployment, hunger, and disability; direct trauma includes war, gender-based violence, child abuse and neglect, forced displacements, criminal activity, human trafficking and exploitation, and political violence. Natural violence includes earthquakes, tsunamis, death, volcanoes, storms, and other weather systems, drought, and wildfire. Going back to Dr. Monte's quote, experiencing any one of these types of violence does not automatically create a trauma response because of protective factors and if the experience is validated. However, these subjects present in our professional world, and we need the tools allowing us to witness pain associated with these various types of violences and provide validation of the patient experience. So Farrell and Taylor identified 5 points to remember when presenting lessons focused on violence. 1, in any population will include those who've experienced a toxic stressor. 2, the populations will include those who have direct or indirect experience of the violent act or acts under discussions. 3, there's a potential for re-triggering individuals who have the previous experience. And 4, the individuals have coping strategies that may include dissociation from the material that is being presented. At a minimum, cortisol released by the students experiencing stress will prevent attending to the materials. And 5, there are advantages and disadvantages to presenting the material in a detached and therefore theoretical exercise or presenting it in an empathically connected way. A theoretical focus separates the learner from the real life experience using abstract descriptions of survivors' symptoms, which reinforces clinical detachment from the material. However, students will be faced with real life situations and need the tools and skills to bear witness to the distress of their patients and clients and have an empathic connection. And the empathic connection can lead to vicarious trauma, especially if the student is not prepared to bear witness. As educators, we should be prepared to mitigate adverse reactions and prepare these students to use tools in their professional practice. Part of this set of tools is the use of physical and psychological grounding techniques at the close of every teaching session that's focused on trauma. Having students grounded going into the exposure reduces their arousal, provides tools they can use during the exposure if their level of distress increases, and revisiting the grounding technique at the end of the exposure increases their ability to move on to their next task with less distress. This is much like teaching what the mindfulness skills in DBT look like as the first step in the group process. If a student cannot re-regulate using the grounding skills, this is a time for a higher level intervention, including one-to-one time. To understand the cultural, structural, and direct violence students become aware of in the cruelty, they become aware of the cruelty of others, and responses to natural violence may also involve cruelty. Discussions of intersectionality help students understand the relationship between the various types of violence and social status. This wheel of powerless and privilege provides a visual representation of intersectionality, and although pain and other reactions to trauma are individual and based on personal perceptions and protective factors, these visualizations can interrupt discussions comparing the severity of traumatic events, which can further marginalize students of color. So it's up to us to provide safe spaces in experiential learning. There's a psychodynamic approach to identify the classroom as a safe transitional space for practice, necessitating the creation of safe learning spaces by establishing ground rules, providing lessons in listening and witnessing, teaching by example, and developing a reflexive attitude. In my EMPA leadership class, we were taught to develop norms and values as a group so that everyone agreed and had buy-in. This makes it easier to hold cohort members accountable for violations of the agreed upon norms and values. Experiential psychodynamic learning allows for discussions of how competition, conflict, and the exercise of authority, which underlie trauma, and the basis of our attitude towards those, are laid down early in life. This practice itself is transformative, as unconscious beliefs are made explicit and can be challenged if necessary. The norms and values identified by the cohort help to create a safe, non-judgmental space based on mutual trust and respect. Although there is some encouragement around non-censorship, as diversity increases, dominant groups are introduced to subjects they have never needed to discuss. So there may be a need to protect students who are from marginalized groups to prevent further harm. Clear boundaries around the intolerance of put-downs, bullying, and name-calling must be established. Transforming the classroom into a safe space necessitates holding the students with feelings of boundaries and limits, of being held together, and not in danger of chaotic disintegration in an emotionally charged but unmanaged situation. The physical boundaries provided by the setting are room temperature, lighting and seating arrangements, movable furniture allowing for varied configurations based on need. The time and timing of the class experience also contributes to a sense of safety. Transitions are exceedingly important. Consistency and predictability provide a sense of security. First, the students need to know what subjects, including those likely to be linked to trauma, will be presented and when. This information should be available in the class description and in the syllabus. Changes to the organization of subject matter needs to be communicated and done so in several different manners. Excuse me. For example, in class built in Canvas, there's a chat feature, announcements, office hours, discussion postings, and the ability to email. Because students will have various levels of exposure to trauma, it is important that all students be taught grounding exercises, to be given concrete examples of self-care, and have a list of supportive services. Although self-care is included as a topic in many programs, students need to learn practices that help with emotional regulation and have 2 or 3 identified as helpful for maintaining regulation during the discussions of traumatic materials and for re-regulation after the exposure. For example, I work to take deep breaths during the presentation or interactions with traumatic materials. I know that I can take a bike ride or engage in rhythmic movement, which also helps me transition from the trauma to my next experience, even if this is just a walk around the block. If the exposure to trauma continues to linger, a compassionate hand allows for validating my own distress and my perception of the distress of the other. A module or class session where trauma is presented should begin with a preparation focused on grounding as part of the introduction. This serves two purposes. One, we're modeling the behavior, and two, we're allowing the student to begin the exposure from a more regulated head and heart space. When students report feeling regulated, the exposure to the trauma can begin. At the end of the exposure to trauma, the student should be led through another re-regulating exercise. The resiliency of students must be built over time with dose-dependent exposure, increasing in frequency and intensity. Debriefings after the exposure recognize that witnessing trauma is a messy process, allowing for free-flowing dialogue, inquiry, and surfacing of underlying latent issues. The qualities of master therapist, as identified, are flexibility, sensitivity, and the ability to create a place of sanctuary in order to form warm and supportive relationships through the capacity to be self-aware, reflective, non-defensive, and open to feedback. Allowing therapists to be congruent, authentic, and honest. This is practiced through bearing witness, which is the quality of listening that attends to subtext and preconscious material, or in other words, what is not being said about the underlying emotions and beliefs. Teaching reflexivity by sharing self-questioning and admitting to not knowing, acknowledging opportunities to learn and change, and acknowledging their knowledge includes the subjectivity of their own viewpoint and life experience, provides professors the opportunity to develop the reflective abilities of their students. Journaling and producing reflective tasks hone these skills and allows professors feedback of a private nature when appropriate. So trauma responsive teaching is teaching how we will show up for the trauma. Given that 66 to 85% of college students have a history of trauma, and 9 to 12% of those students meet the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, we already have a risk of re-traumatization and secondary trauma. Service providers and leaders of organizations who have a history of trauma can be a great asset due to their lived experience, but supports need to be put in place through the educational process. To be trauma-informed in any context is to understand how violence, victimization, and other traumatic experiences may have figured into the lives of individuals involved, and to apply that understanding to the provision of services and design of systems so that they can accommodate the needs and vulnerabilities of trauma survivors. At a minimum, given that service learning projects are initiated as part of the educational framework, every student in a program should have a working knowledge of trauma, presentation of trauma, the trauma associated with oppression and self-regulation, self-care methods to prevent secondary trauma or re-traumatization. The lack of knowledge around trauma risks that re-traumatization of those in the service learning projects. Teaching about trauma is essential to comprehending and confronting the human experience, but to honor the humanity and dignity of both the trauma's victims and those learning from them, education must proceed with compassion and responsibility toward both. This can be done through understanding that learning is the primary goal, The emotional safety of the student is a condition for learning, and the need to be aware of cultural expressions of distress and the cultural expressions of emotion and distress. Many students can be exploited due to their histories of trauma. They may re-experience symptoms, and it may be necessary to refer those students to crisis services or counseling. Thus, the professor must know how to access these services. Understanding how previous trauma may impact a student's academics, need to gain a familiarity with the scientific research, re-traumatization, and secondary traumatization, and note the serious psychosocial and educational sequelae that may be associated with each. You must gain an understanding of the clinical literature on trauma transfer and countertransference to understand reactions to trauma that may be elicited by materials presented as part of the class. We must also examine assumptions that teaching trauma is good. Although there may be a benefit for those who so successfully adapt, this is especially important for those developing psychologists, social workers, and counselors who need to be prepared for listening to, responding to, and holding the traumatic experience of clients and patients. We cannot assume that students, especially students from interprofessional teams, already know self-care, emotional regulation, and grounding strategies. And these self-care strategies require skill building that includes learning to check in with our own bodies to create an awareness of our own level of arousal, and then learning to take that awareness into the work with our patients. And working with our own muscle tension, improving muscle tone, and our ability to relax. There's a reason why firefighters tend to spend a lot of time in the gym, and it's not just because of dragging around heavy hoses. There are psychological as well as physical benefits to improving our muscle tone, and movement helps us burn off the adrenaline and cortisol. If we stay in a heightened state, those hormones are toxic over time. We also cannot assume that our students know how to be reflexive. So having an outline or prompts can teach students how to use reflection to process their own experiences. So there's some broad takeaways when we are journaling or engaging in reflexive activities. Some of these broad takeaways are, what do I think I know from this experience? How do I think I know it? And will this knowledge change the course of how I do the work? We also need to reflect on our specific reflections of the experience, noticing our assumptions. What assumptions did I make about the client or patient? What assumptions did I make about comments or questions that were in response to my own questions? And how do these assumptions affect or shape the questions I ask? We also need to have prompts around our values, beliefs, our life stories, and the socioeconomic statuses. So how did my personal values, beliefs, life stories, and or social economic status affect or shape the questions I asked? Or my listening skills, or my behavior? Prompts around emotional connections with the patients or clients. To what degree did my emotions or feelings affect or shape the questions I asked, or my listening skills, or my behavior? And how will my emotions or feelings for the patient or client affect my analytical process and my ability to draw valid interpretations? And also, we need an awareness of our physical environment. How did the physical setting or location alter how I related to the patient or client? And were there physical logistics that contributed to the success or weaknesses in the interventions? And having an expectation that a reflective journal will be reviewed by the professor allows for check-ins and another avenue for checking if the student is experiencing some red flags. And then lastly, the formation and use of critical dyads builds resources for peer support and mutuality and allows for opportunities to learn consultation and the ability to challenge each other in constructive ways. These dyads can be interprofessional, two counselors, for example, or interprofessional between medical and health providers as part of developing the interprofessional theme. So some red flags that we need to be watching as we're working with issues that can be traumatic. So if we're noticing interactions with classmates, that can be an indicator of unresolved trauma, which can impede the education process. And these red flags include a lack of self-regulation, a lack of social thinking skills, lack of attention and working memory skills, and a lack of cognitive flexibility. These lagging skills may present as aggressiveness, reactiveness, or displays of other strong feelings in moments of vulnerability, a lack of connection, a lack of self-awareness, which can include oversharing or a lack of awareness of how others are feeling. Avoidance can be evident by skipping class or steering clear of contact with professors or other authority figures, having poor boundaries, low self-confidence, and again, just demonstrating that cognitive inflexibility. The lack of awareness may present competitively as my trauma is worse than yours, necessitating education around the intersectionality associated with trauma and the associated protective factors. Interventions may include building a relationship with struggling students through frequent check-ins, inquiring about self-care, and providing feedback to the student regarding patterns of behavior and asking students what they need for support in order to be successful. A referral to counseling is recommended if the lagging skills continue, and it may be necessary to have a formal written behavior agreement addressing the specific problematic behavior and spelling out what the student needs to do in order to continue in the program. If the student is still unable to change, a leave of absence is warranted or leaving the program. There is value in lived experience, and students who are willing to work on their trauma are open to constructive feedback and who can engage in self-reflection, allowing them to process and make sense of their trauma, may also build self-awareness, empathy, and sensitivity, all which are hallmarks of good counselors. So factors to consider when teaching the 4 violences. We teach trauma with to the reference, as it reinforces the separation between a violent event and the interpretation or perception of trauma by an individual. Because the 4 violences are so prevalent, it is important to be prepared to hear a patient or client has experienced trauma. Using trauma-informed lens also allows us to understand why a person may not be acting in the way we expect. We can provide signposts to our students that the material that's going to be discussed will be, that there will be traumatic materials presented. We should give attendees the choice to decide if they want to participate or contribute. We need to be sensitive to the needs of the audience by staying attuned to the atmosphere of the room. We need to provide regular breaks from the material. We need to encourage dialogue and to promote direct discussions within the teaching session. We need to provide regular check-ins and reality checks, including validating the difficulty of the student experience and using grounding techniques at the end of the presentation. Through promoting self-care and resilience strategies with concrete examples. For example, including in physical activity after the class. And we always need to finish presentation of material that may be traumatic with a debriefing. And some key messages to educators include being able to direct learners to textbooks that are up to date and convey empirical knowledge about trauma, providing guidelines about current research and best clinical practices, and have an awareness that trauma work may include traumatized field and humanitarian workers. So we may not have the patient who experienced the initial trauma directly, but we may be working with people who were helping those who were witnessing or experiencing the trauma. And I have lots of references. So if anybody wants more information, I am happy to provide it. Any questions? I can't see if there's.
Sorry.
No, go ahead, because I'm just going to say I can't see any questions in the chat box.
I was just going to say, if there are any questions, you guys can go ahead to put them in the chat box and go ahead and put them in the chat box. We do have a few more minutes left in this session before we have to move on to the next one. But if there are no other questions, we can end the session. Just as a reminder, in the chat, you will receive, I put in the chat earlier, you guys will receive an email with a program evaluation. Make sure to complete that if you intend on receiving continuing education certificates. Oh, we have one question in the chat asking if you can show the YouTube video again. If you aren't able to play it again, maybe we can copy and paste the link into the chat as well so people can kind of save and access that.
We'll play up on this screen.
If it's showing on your screen, oh, there it is. Spoke too soon, sorry.
I'm figuring it out. Yep, it just repeats over. But there's all sorts of those nice little videos, or there's a whole long list of apps that have some breathing exercises that we use kind of anywhere.
We have any other questions?
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for presenting today. It was really entertaining. It was interesting. I enjoyed the breath work at the beginning as well. So if there are no other questions, oh, I'm sorry. So if there are no other questions, I'm going to go ahead and end the call for today. Thanks for joining us, everybody, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon.